Well, greetings, everyone. I hope everyone has been let into the webinar so we can start. I'm Lou Lipsitz. I have the great privilege of being the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Gerontology, Medical Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to start off our webinar. I would like to acknowledge first that I am talking to you from the land of the Massachusetts nation, here obviously in the Boston area of Massachusetts. Today we're going to talk about promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Journals of Gerontology. We'll talk about the peer review and publication practices for the medical sciences section, but what we describe today is really relevant to any journal publications that you might be participating in. So next slide, please. Some of our housekeeping items are listed here. I just want to mention a couple of them. We will leave about a half an hour at the end of the webinar for questions. So I would encourage you to put those questions into the chat box, and then we will extract them out and read them at the end of the session. Please keep in mind that our conversation is being recorded, and it will be archived on the GSA's website and made available for free for a period of time in the beginning of the presentation on the website. Also, I'd like to ask you to keep your video off and your audio muted for the first part of our webinar, and then you can come back on at the time of our discussion and question and answer session. So with that, why don't we move forward? Next slide, thank you. Our webinar panel is listed in, actually before that, there we go. Here, this is really an outstanding panel that will be presenting to you today and answering questions. I will mention their names and we will introduce them later before each of their talks. Cole Alec is joining us from the Washington State University, Joyce Ballsbury from Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, Deidre Buchwald from Washington State University, Jason Flatt from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, Kathy Jackson, who is our managing editor at the GSA, Gladys Maestra from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, Shana Stites from the University of Pennsylvania, and Roland Thorpe from Johns Hopkins University. So you can see that we have wide representation across the country with experts in many of the areas that we'll be speaking on. Next slide, please. Our moderator today is Jason Flatt. Many thanks to him for stepping up and, first of all, assembling our panel and introducing them and helping us with the question and answer session. We will then have a brief introduction by me, an overview of the guidelines by Roland Thorpe. We will talk about tracking diversity in the publication process, current knowledge, challenges, and future directions by Kathy Jackson. Shana Stites will talk about sex, gender, and sexual orientation. Joy Ballsbury will talk about addressing race, ethnicity, and culture without racism. And Gladys Maestra will talk about addressing Latina, Latino, Latinx, and Hispanic ethnicity. We will address considerations for publications on American Indian, and Alaskan Native peoples by Deidre Buchwald and Cole Alec. And finally, as I mentioned, we'll leave time for questions and discussion. Next slide. So why are we holding this webinar? First, we all recognize that inequality, oppression, and racism exist within our journals. We further recognize that such long-standing conditions and implicit biases inhibit the development and implementation of science and scholarship, and that this perpetuates inequity. As editors, and authors, we affirm that aging represents a kaleidoscope of experience with diverse lifelong and acquired identities. We aspire to represent the wealth and breadth of aging experience in the scholarship we publish. And we recognize that systems of inequity and bias have diminished such representation in our journals. Next slide. We therefore commit to encouraging cutting-edge, conceptually driven, evidence-based work that addresses and aims to overcome inequities that arise from age, socioeconomic status, racial, ethnic, sex, and gender bias and discrimination, geography, and intersections among all of these factors. And we further commit to building and maintaining a very diverse author, reviewer, and editorial cohorts that will nurture this scholarship in years to come. Because of these commitments and recognition that racism exists within our publications, we have developed several guidelines that we want to share with you today. First, Suzanne Meeks published guidelines in the Gerontologist that are applicable to all of the journals of gerontology. And together, Roland Thorpe, Michelle Oden, and I published an editorial last year that further expands upon those guidelines for the Journal of Gerontology Medical Sciences. We will discuss those in a minute, but I would like to turn over our webinar to Jason Flatt, who will introduce our speakers and moderate throughout our session. So Jason, you're on.
Yes, thanks so much, Lou. So our next presenter is going to be Dr. Roland Thorpe, who is a professor in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And he serves as the Deputy Director of the Hopkins Center for Health Disparities Solutions, also as a co-director of the Johns Hopkins Alzheimer's Disease Resource Center for Minority Aging Research, and co-director of the Health Equity and Social Justice concentration of their Doctor of Public Health program. And he holds joint appointments in the Division of Geriatric Medicine and Gerontology and the Department of Neurology in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the Department of Sociology in the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. And as a social epidemiologist and gerontologist, Dr. Thorpe's research focuses on how race, socioeconomic status, and segregation influence health and well-being for African Americans, and particularly among African American men. So Dr. Thorpe, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will pass the screen to you.
So first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Flatt, for the wonderful introduction. I want to say thank you to GSA for affording us the opportunity to have this space and to have this conversation. I think it's critical for where we are in our society today to think about how to move forward to create a space where there's inclusive excellence in the publication process, thereby creating a greater innovation for more diverse science to be published. And so what I want to do is I want to first thank Dr. Susan Meeks for that outstanding article that they wrote to put together guidelines across all of the GSA journals. And here, what I wanted to go just to briefly go through and share with you some actionable items that Dr. Oden and Dr. Lipset thought that we could place here for the Journals of Gerontology Medical Sciences. And some of these actionable items, as you'll see, are very measurable, and we intend to be able to report out on where we are on many of them. So there are 9 items, and I just want to briefly go through each one of them. One of the first items is that we want to make sure we recognize individual and racism and discrimination as drivers of health inequities. And we want to do that to encourage more topics, a broader range of topics that focuses on how we address those drivers of health inequities. And I think we started to do this in our first special issue that we've had. The second thing is that we will include minority health issues as a section in the medical sciences, and we've already done that. We will devote future issues on the topics of health disparities across the life course, minority aging, discrimination, racism, and minority health, and uplift those different problems that may occur in specific populations. And not only do that, but write from an assets-based approach as to not to further stigmatize those populations. The other thing, action item we had as a guideline is that we want to achieve more diversity on the editorial board and the reviewer pool. And I'd like to thank Ms. Kathleen Jackson for actually working with myself and Dr. Lipset. So I'm glad to say that we have achieved some more diversity on the editorial board and in the reviewer pool, but there's still work to be done there. Next slide, please. Okay, and the fifth guideline here is that we want to ask people, our authors, to use inclusive person-centered language. So which places the individual role as a person before the condition. For example, instead of saying diabetics, we want to use older adults with diabetes. And that, again, that writes from an asset-based focus, and want to also advocate for preferred language. And then we want to also ask that race and ethnicity categories be collected and reported, and then that the source of classification be included in the methods section. So this is extremely important. When we say it's sources of methods, we're talking about self-report, or is it electronic health records? And also, as it relates to race and ethnicity, we want to require the authors to capitalize the name of races, ethnicities, and nations, and to use racial and ethnic terms as adjectives instead of nouns. For example, Black older adults. Next slide. And when we're thinking about when we analyze race and ethnicity variables, we want to ask authors to specify their conceptualization. So we want them to share with us in the document for transparency if they're adjusted. We were looking for them to share with us if they're adjusted for race and ethnicity, or if they stratified on race and ethnicity, and to provide us some context around how they conceptualize that race and ethnicity variable that was being used in their paper. And finally, we want authors to acknowledge the lack of representation of study population in their limitation sections of papers when this is appropriate. Next slide, please. All right. And so I think these are some guideline action items that we've put forth for us to start thinking about in medical sciences, how to achieve those goals. It's not necessarily easy to answer, but our goal here overall with these guidelines is to have it as a measuring rod for us at JGMS to make sure that we're not only increasing the awareness, but we're also seeing these articles, better transparency in articles around the writing of race and ethnicity, and as well it affords us the opportunity to start the conversation with some of these guidelines, and it provides us a space to be able to educate each other in this area, which I think is very important in a time and space where we look to achieve inclusive excellence in the publication process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thorpe. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Kathleen Jackson, who is the managing editor of the Medical Sciences section of the Journals of Gerontology, Series A. She also manages the Biological Sciences section of the journal and both sections of the Journals of Gerontology, Series B. That's the Psychological Sciences and Social Sciences. So Ms. Jackson has been a longtime advocate for diversifying the reviewer pool, the editorial boards, and the associate editors for her journals. And she credits her 3 sons who she adopted for increasing her awareness of disparities and discrimination for racial ethnic minorities. Their presence has enriched her life and made her realize that not only is it okay to talk about race, it is even better to speak out about discrimination and microaggressions that take place. So without further ado, Kathy Jackson, please feel free to take over.
Next slide, Jason. So I wanted to start with just a quick statement. What I'm not, but more who I am. DEI became so important to me because my guys, who are now men, as they began to express their interest, I couldn't find Black role models for them, even in the sciences. So I began to see how much representation mattered. So that's what prompted me to begin speaking up about the editorial boards. Next slide. The goal was to make sure that editorial boards reflect the population. And as our editorial board continues to grow, the goal will be the same. But as you can see in this slide, when I started in 2005, 6% of the associate editors were from a minority and 8% of the editorial board. And now in 2022, 37% of our associate editors are from a minority group and 25% of our editorial board is from a minority group. So, we've made progress, and that's something I'm so proud of. Next slide. While implicit biases are intentional and controllable, implicit biases are not so. A person can express certain attitudes or beliefs while having a similar biases on an unconscious level. And the best example I can give is a personal one. About 10 years ago, a friend of 40 years came to visit. I live in Washington, D.C. She had always stated a belief that Blacks and whites were equal and should be treated the same. But about 10 years ago, while she was visiting, two things happened that really made me see what an implicit bias was. We were driving around in my neighborhood and we came to a stop sign, and on the side, on the right side, on the passenger side, there was a group of African-American teen boys just hanging out on a porch stoop, and she locked her door. I told her that in a few years that my boys were going to look like this, and then she proceeded to assure me that she didn't see my boys as being Black. And I responded her that they were Black and that those boys were another mother's boys. And by the way, she's kidding herself if she didn't think that they heard her lock the door. And it just made it really clear what implicit bias was. So as academia has diversified, the number of minority PhDs has increased, but the number of publications from first authors being from an underrepresented minority has not increased. And I sort of got that. I had asked OUP to run the list of titles published over the last 5 years that dealt with minority populations. And I looked up first authors on all of them. And over I looked at a couple years and I just didn't see an increase in the number of first authors being from underrepresented minorities. Okay, next one. All right, so right now, there's no way to identify minority authors or reviewers in Scholar One, and this has a lot to do with the privacy laws in the EU. But OUP has told us at GSA that they're trying to work on a way to help us with that. But in 2022, I learned that Scholar One had a new feature called credit taxonomy. And this, it's basically, it's a high level classification of the diverse roles performed in the work leading to a publication. It provides transparency and helps us see who the contributions to this published work so that we're enabled improve systems of attribution, credit, and accountability. So I think when we get a way to identify underrepresented minorities, we'll get a better picture of who's doing what, and hopefully it will lead to some more equity and more recognition. Okay, next one. So while looking at this whole idea of diversity and ways that there can be some implicit bias in journal submissions, after I looked at authors, I looked at who was funding. And while looking at diversity and funding, this was found. You can flip the slide. And it basically sort of told me what I thought I already understood, was that while applicants and awardees from underrepresented racial minority groups experience a higher pace of growth than majority groups, the funding rate is still much lower than majority applicants. Next one. So then I wanted to look at who the reviewers were. And I wondered, can reviewers be biased, and can bias go both ways? Would reviewers from the same race as an author have a bias toward that race? Another question in the peer review process is who gets reviewed? What about manuscripts from lesser known authors, from Northern versus Southern Hemisphere, authors from certain countries, men versus women, different racial and ethnic groups than the editor, authors where English is clearly not the first language? Are there biases? It might be helpful if when we ask someone that we know is a minority reviewer, if they decline, it might be helpful to ask them who they think would be a review. We need to be careful about not overburdening minority reviewers so that we're not creating a tax on their time. All right, next one. Who do people cite? Do people only cite the people that they know? Are minority authors, probably lesser known authors, being cited, or are only known authors being cited? Next one. So as I was getting ready for this, Nature dropped me a present and someone tweeted it to sort of give an idea of the whole idea of citation inequities. Basically, in this graph, it shows that men are cited a higher level than women, no matter what the race. The dotted lines are men and the colored lines represent, dotted lines are men, the straight lines are women, and the different colors are the races, races. Blue is white, yellow is black, orange is Latinx, and dark blue is Asian. And this chart shows that consistently women are cited less than men, no matter what minority group. Next one. In the end, all things are linked to citations. When you get cited, you get more opportunities for authorship in publications. Then you might be more likely to be recognized and awarded for your work. When you're cited, there's increased opportunities for career advancement and more likely to be included in the peer review process or invited to an editorial board. If you're highly cited, you're more likely to have editorship opportunities and be a bigger part of the scholarly community. And then if you're cited, you're more likely to have opportunities for funding because people will see that your research is relevant. Citations matter. Next one. So I was asked to provide some examples of submissions that I thought might raise some questions about implicit bias. And the first one was a manuscript that talked about skin color and discrimination. And in this one, the authors, the lead author was African American, and all of the co-authors were from an underrepresented minority. They all had funding and they all had NIH funding, but the reviewer section was kind of interesting because there were 3 reviewers, 2 were African American and 1 was white. And at the end of the first round of review, the 2 African American reviewers had asked for a revise and resubmit, but the white reviewer had asked that the manuscript be submitted. And then I just noted that about half or more of their references were underrepresented minorities. So I thought that was pretty good. Next one. This one, another one was a manuscript about race and cognition. And the first thing that stood out to me on this one was that all of the authors were white and they were from an institution that is currently in the process of making reparations to slave descendants. The senior author had the funding. It ended up being desk rejected because of mechanism problems, and about 1/3 of their references were minority first author. Next one. And then there was one, cardiovascular and biomarker changes in health disparities. The lead author was African American. Everybody had an NIH funding. The reviewers, both reviewers were white, and about 1/3 of the references were minority first author. Next one. So actionable outcomes for diversity. I don't have any easy answers, but right now the credit taxonomy is optional, but do we want to talk about making it mandatory? Do we want to start to include a positionality statement and a citation diversity statement? And another one of my editors wants to develop reviewer guidelines specifically for addressing submissions on underrepresented minority populations, and any other ideas would be most welcome, because I think all the titles in GSA are working really hard to address this. Next one. And then Our sister journal, the Gerontologist, recently published an article that had a positionality statement and a citation diversity statement. So I just wanted to include an example of what that could possibly look like. And I think I'm done.
Great. Thank you, Kathy.
Yep.
I'm now going to pass the slides to Dr. Shana Stites, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. And as a clinical psychologist and researcher with the Penn program on precision medicines for the brain, Dr. Stites focuses on advancing diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. The goal is to understand ways to promote quality of life and psychological well-being, which includes looking closely at the impacts of the disease on individuals who may be directly affected by pathology, as well as their family members. And as part of this work, Dr. Stites has a special focus on understanding how aspects of identity, such as age, gender, and race, operate as determinants in the disease experience, which may offer insights into disease mechanisms and the development of interventions that help limit burdens of the disease. So Dr. Stites will be talking with us about sex, gender, and sexual orientation.
Thank you, Dr. Flett. To get us started here, I wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to present today, and it's wonderful that GSA is putting the event like this together. I really appreciate the chance to be part of it. So my talk today is on sex, gender, and sexual orientation. The goal of my talk is to highlight a few examples of where peer review tends to fall short in addressing these constructs, and to give some examples of ways to possibly improve that process. To get us started, how about some definitions to make sure we're all thinking about these concepts the same way? The term sex, at least in the context of this presentation, refers to the different biologic and physiologic characteristics of males and females, such as reproductive organs, chromosomes, and sexually dimorphic characteristics. Gender refers to the socially constructed characteristics of women and men, such as norms, roles, and relationships between these groups of men and women. Sexual orientation refers to a part of an individual's identity that includes a person's sexual or emotional attractions to another person and the behavior and or social affiliation that may result from this attraction. The figure on the right does the work to remind us that sex, gender, and sexual orientation are multifactorial. Go ahead, Dr. Flett. Now, let me show you a few examples from the literature that highlight common problems as they may relate to sex, gender, and sexual orientation. Often the terms, our language is constantly evolving, fluid, and so terms can be sort of in fashion as well as become outdated. Even in this article here from 2019, which, believe it or not, is just a couple of years ago, we still see the use of some terms that are now outdated, right? Like transsexual. Next slide. Dr. Thorpe had referred to, in terms of talking about race, in moving away from using group identity as towards now adjectives rather than nouns. And we see the same phenomenon here in referring to gays as a noun rather than a group descriptor. A third example that I don't really have a slide for because it's actually reflective of omissions of information rather than misrepresentation is that biomedical research often does not report conceptualizations, methods, or the limitations of these constructs. And we see that constantly throughout the literature. Go ahead, next slide, please. So what are the conceptualizations? Let's take a quick look at why sex and gender are considered in research on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. These concepts, it's important to include them, especially including also sexual orientation, is that these concepts are important to communication, decision-making, and stakeholder engagement. Gender roles, gender relations, gender identity, institutionalized gender influence how interventions work, for whom they work, under what circumstances they work, and perhaps even on occasion why they work. Program theories may operate differently within and across sexes and genders. And that extends, I know definitions to this point have focused on heavily on binary, but this does also include the continuum of sexes and genders. Without proper study, implementation strategies may unintentionally either exploit or ignore rather than transform current thinking around sex and gender-related factors. Go ahead, please. In a given study, sex and gender typically have one or more of these three roles here. They can have four roles. They can help us identify a sex or gender difference. They can evaluate the possible influence of sex, gender, or sex-gender when it's unclear, or it might be both concepts operating on an outcome variable. And sometimes it's necessary to control for their influence as a potential confounding variable in the relationships that we're studying. Characterizing sex and gender data requires, at a minimum, describing a sample and reporting the results by those categories. This is important in terms of power calculations, as well as understanding how our main effects may differ by these influences. Sexual orientation may aid in identifying differences in behavioral risk factors, uptake of interventions, as well as useful in characterizing samples. Next slide, please. Individuals conducting research in this space attribute the failure to recognize the importance of sex, gender, sexual orientation in research as being closely intertwined with the gendered nature of academic publishing, which Kathleen spoke about a little bit in her presentation. Lancet has gone so far as to publish a checklist to help researchers and presumably editors and publishers work through whether sex and gender have been properly considered or reported on. Here is the Lancet checklist. Go through them quickly. Was the consideration of sex or gender relevant for the research that's under consideration? Did the study design enable sex and gender differences to be investigated? Were the groups involved in the study sex or gender balanced? Was the primary outcome analyzed according to sex or a gender variable? Have you discussed the implications of the research for men and women and presumably other social groups as well? Going back to a point Dr. Thorpe made, is it's often overlooked the omission or absence of certain groups are often omitted in the discussion of limitations. And here you can see non-binary individuals being excluded or intersex individuals that are not represented in data. Okay, next slide. There are guidelines that have been put forth by standard setting organizations. Here we see a few from those put forth by NIH, the National Institutes of Health. Explicitly state in the title or abstract when a single sex gender has been used in a study, or when the results only apply to one sex or gender. Always attempt to report the sex of cells, tissues, or animals used to conduct work, or disclose when the sex of biological materials is unknown. Disclose whether the study was powered to detect sex or gender differences, whether statistical analyses were designed prior to data collection, and whether sex gender was factored into those a priori analyses. Present descriptive statistics by sex gender to inform sample size and power calculations, and to enable sex gender based meta-analyses in future studies. So again, simple steps in reviewing, taking a quick glance at tables to see if this information is being presented. Next slide, please. Recognizing their responsibility to promote accurate reporting of sex and gender, the European Association of Science Editors established a gender policy committee in 2012 and present these SAGER reporting standards that build upon and connect over with the NIH standards. I won't go into each one of these, but I will point out that there are the general standards we've been talking about, and that within each section of an article or a submission, you could be tending to see if sex, gender, sexual, and potentially sexual orientation have been properly addressed or acknowledged. And next slide. If you're interested in any of the materials that I've talked about here, these are their citations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Stites. We're now going to pass the mic to Dr. Joyce Ballsbury, who is an associate professor of neurology at Washington University School of Medicine and the core leader for the newly established Health Disparities and Equity Core in the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Previously, she was an assistant professor of epidemiology and senior associate consultant at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science. Dr. Ballsbury's work as a scientist centers on the importance of research to increase health equity in minority and under-resourced communities. She recently completed a patient-centered outcomes research institute project to expand the efforts of minority women in research network, which was established in 2011. And the network's mission is to promote community patient engagement in research conducted by minority women scientists interested in research collaborations, academic scholarship, innovation, and dissemination. So I'm going to stop sharing and pass the screen to Dr. Ballsbury.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Flatt, for that wonderful introduction. So I call myself the outlier for many reasons. Often I will speak without slides. So I hope that, that this is engaging. And if there are things that come up, please just put those in the questions that come up. And I want you to know that I may use some terms that, that may spark debate, but please understand that I'm speaking to you as someone with a lived experience of being an African-American woman, a Black woman, and a Black woman that lives with a cognitive disability. I live every day with dyslexia. So, so often I will give examples from my own life to show how that impacts science as well. So I was asked to speak about a topic that is very, very close to my heart, which is race and racism. We'll have a colleague of mine. She'll be speaking a little bit today in the time that we have allotted about ethnicity and the like. But I would like to begin with acknowledging the land that I sit on here in St. Louis, Missouri, which is actually my hometown. I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional homelands of Native people, and that I want to pay my respect to the elders of the past and the present and thank them for their hospitality today. So race is a term, it is an adjective. When you look it up in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, you'll see it used as defined as a noun and a verb. And I know we have a shift where we are using race as a term, as an adjective. So the term race is a term that is based on our physical, our outward characteristics, and it's often used related to a shared ancestry. It also is linked to oftentimes to our social qualities that relate to a given society that we may be a part of. Whereas ethnicity, on the other hand, is also, when you look them up in the dictionary, are often used in terms of a fact or a state of being, a part of a social or a cultural group or a cultural tradition. And so we think about race as those outward physical characteristics that make us who we are. So for instance, my skin tone and things like that. And ethnicity often refers to those cultural conditions. So in the United States, we have, unlike some of our other countries, we have only a few census-related defined racial categories, and those are white, Black, or African-American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander. And each of those groups really don't tell all of the characteristics of those communities. And then in terms of ethnicity, according to the US Census, there are 3 major categories, but often in science, we only talk about really 1. So so the terms that are often used are Hispanic, Latin, and Spanish. But we'll also hear the terms Latin, Latina, Latino, and Latinx. And so I won't dive too much into those terms, but I will talk a little bit about how race and racism impact what we do in our society. So when we think about the term racism, it goes back to prejudice that impact communities of color. And I tend to use the term people of color, which I feel is more inclusive in terms of thinking about the cultural and racial categories that different communities who physically come from the same, are a part of similar groups. So as we are reporting race in our data, it's important to talk about those sources that we're using when we think about race. So for instance, how was the data obtained? Was it based on self-report? If it is based on self-report, then we need to make sure that we state that. Is the race based on data from a medical record if we're doing retrospective data analysis? And if so, how was that data obtained? It's important to be very clear in our definitions that we're using when we're analyzing data. And then when we are grouping people of color, when we're doing analysis, because as an epidemiologist, I like clean data. So when I group people together in my analysis, am I further marginalizing them? So this takes into consideration the historical underpinnings that impact historically minoritized communities of color, especially in the United States, and how is the information that we are providing through our scientific inquiry, is that further marginalizing the communities? So for instance, if we have a finding and we're looking at racial data dichotomously, so as Black or white, or even ethnic based on ethnicity, are we further hurting communities of color when we report our findings? Are we making inferences in a way that is not helpful to those communities? And oftentimes, as scientists, we don't always think about those things. We report what we find, but we don't think about the interpretation of what we found. So I always go back to thinking about the communities in which I work in and work with. And when I'm writing up my manuscripts, I often will have my community partners even read my discussion sections to make sure that the inferences that I'm making is not going to damage or hurt their community. And I know that's an extra step, but I use community-based participatory research in my lab for that reason, to make sure that I am not further marginalizing the community that I come from, the communities that I don't come from, and really thinking about the historical pain that has happened for those communities, especially the African-American community here in my hometown of St. Louis. So we know that in our society, racism is often seen as a bad word. And so I challenge each of us to really think about the historical context of the communities in which we come from and how race is viewed in a way that, that is social and political. And so while we don't always think about that in the context of the science we do, but others use our science and the publications that we have to change policy. So as each of us are writing our papers, as each of us are reviewing papers, and we see papers come into the journals in which we're submitting or asked to review or serving on editorial boards, we take into context on how the authors of those manuscripts, whether or not they had clear definitions of race, And if so, what do those definitions come from? And then another thing, how was that data collected? And did the authors take into consideration the historical context of what race means in the societies in which they come from? So recently, I gave a talk on to a medical society, I won't name names, and the feedback that came was, well, why are we talking about racism? Well, we were having a conversation about the closure of hospital systems in the community, well, namely St. Louis, and how those hospitals were closed in Black neighborhoods. And that related to, that impacted communities of color within those neighborhoods. And many of the residents in those communities now suffer from health disparities. So when we start to think about social determinants of health, when we start to think about structural vulnerability to health, those things make a difference in whether or not someone will even engage in the science that we do if they already feel historically minoritized and marginalized based on a phenotypic characteristics in which they cannot change, i.e. their race. So taking all of those things into consideration, it is important that as we're writing our papers, that we think about the communities in which we live, in which we work. And often we might do work in communities in which we don't come from, which I also do. And so that means making sure that we're thinking about those cultural brokers that can really help us to capture what is important for those communities in terms of reporting health data and even our findings in science. So I would say that that means really, thinking about not only how the data is collected, where the data is collected, and when the data is collected, and also making sure that we include stakeholders from those communities as partners in science so that we are not further causing injury to communities of color. And so I will stop there because I know that we're going to have time for questions at the end. And I'd like to hear from each of you on what's being done to make sure that we're not minoritizing or marginalizing communities in which you do research as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balsbury. I'm now going to pass the presentation over to Dr. Gladys Maestra, who is a professor of neuroscience and human genetics and the director of the Rio Grande Valley Alzheimer's Disease Resource Center for Minority Aging Research at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley School of Medicine. Up, Gladys, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you, Dr. Flatt, and thank you, the organizers of this event. And I would like to acknowledge that there were numerous indigenous nations and tribes living on the land that is now known as the state of Texas. Kiowa, Wichita, Comanche, Apache, Atacapa, Ishak, Viday, Cowiltican, Carrizo, Cado, Yumano, Suma, Easter Pueblo, Carancawa, Cagowa, Kitsai, Tawaconi, Tonkawa, Alabama, Cherokee, Cushata, Kitkapu, Antigua Pueblo. These nations and tribes have stewarded this land for many generations, and we would like to thank them and pay our respects to elders, both past and present. Next. So we've heard, and we are confronted every day by the terms Latinx, Hispanic, Latin America, Latina, Latino, Spanish surname, Spanish-speaking Latinx, and what should we use? Next. First, I want to mention that there are at least 62 million of people that recognize themselves either as Hispanic or Latino, according to the census in 2020. Thanks. Next. And it's necessary to mention why and how the terms have been created really to refer to a population. It's a number of populations. And here comes the pan-ethnicity concept, which refers to the consolidation of groups who have had previously distinct ethnic or national identities into a single racial, or in the case of Latinos, a single ethnic category. So coming from very different countries and very different histories, now they are consolidated basically in one. And there are two interpretations out of this. One is that there is a genuine identity stemming from shared commonalities and the struggle for power, being the most common language, or that this represents a political and a statistical construction predominantly resulting from methodological issues in census of 2000. Next. Next, okay. So basically we have the definition of Hispanic that generally includes people with heritage from Spanish-speaking countries through Latin America, as well as Spain. So Hispanic in relationship to language. Latino and Latina excludes people of Spanish origin outside the Western Hemisphere, but includes those with ancestry from non-Spanish speaking Latin American countries like Brazil, for example, or Haiti with French Creole. And Latinx is the term used to describe people who are of or relate to Latin American origin or descent. And it is a gender neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina. Next. So in the most recent census, the question was, is this person of Hispanic, Latino, or Hispanic origin? In terms of ethnicity, no, not of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. Or yes, could be Mexican, Mexican American, or Chicano. Yes, Puerto Rican. Yes, Cuban, or yes, any other, or any other. So this implies that, of course, the Latinos or Hispanic, or in this category, could have any race. Next. So in fact, NIH requires that the reporting needs to be done in terms of Hispanic or Latino, and not Hispanic or Latino. So there is only two categories for ethnicity, and defines Hispanic or Latino as a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. The term Spanish origin can also be used in addition to Hispanic or Latino. And we have the 5 racial categories that the Latinos can identify on top of other or mixed. Next. But the origin of there is no Latinos or Hispanics in Latin America. There are only Hispanic or Latinos in the US. And this term came about in 1930, where there was an interest in identifying individuals of Mexican origin by the census. This all until 1970, where instead not only individuals of Mexican origin, but individuals of Spanish heritage, mostly identified by language, referred to people that spoke Spanish. And in 1977, there were 2 categories. then for ethnicity, Hispanic origin or not of Hispanic origin. And in 1997, the 5 racial categories were included, and the mix or other was also included. Next. So the term Latino in preparation for the 1990 for the census. Some authors, Hayes, Bautista, and Chapa, in their very important paper in American Journal of Public Health, they call for a standardized terminology to describe persons of Latin American descent residing in the United States. And the argument was really, if we put it in more modern terms, related to social determinants of health. This was a call for identifying a population that had different needs than the majority of the population. Latino was suggested over Hispanic, as the former more closely aligns with political and geographical considerations articulated in the 1823 Monroe Doctrine and US geopolitical intervention in Latin America. Latino became the term largely preferred by social scientists in the United States. Next. The increased use of the term Latino also corresponded with heightened criticisms of the Hispanic label. For example, many believe that Hispanic relied too heavily on the colonial relationship to Spain, erasing the modern Latin American struggle and rise of unique mestizo cultures and identities. Others argue that the term failed to acknowledge the important history of cultural contributions of indigenous, African, and Asian peoples throughout Latin America. As such, the term Latino has been considered a progressive choice over Hispanic for several decades now. Next. The prominence of the term Latino in academia does not correspond with the preferences of Latinos, Hispanics in the United States. So it seems like academicians think that Latino is the way to go, but we'll see that half of the population reports really no preference between Latino and Hispanic. And research consistently finds that Hispanic is the most common pan-ethnic term asserted by Latinos, Hispanic by a margin of at least 2 to 1. So if you ask the person, they say Hispanic. If you ask the academics writing about the people, they say Latino. Next. In relationship to Latinx, about 76% of Latino Hispanics never have not heard the term Latinx. And of those that about 23% that have heard the term, only 3% use it. And I would argue that in academia, it's being used quite often in relationship to the common use of the term in our domestic life. Next. So there are some predictors of the pan-ethnic label preference. So Mexicans and Puerto Ricans prefer the term Hispanic more often, while Cubans select Latino. So it's a very diverse group. And as I mentioned, from many coming from very diverse origins. So you would expect that not everybody agrees, and that there are characteristics that will be assigned preferentially to within the communities. In fact, it has been found that progressives prefer the term of Latino, and conservatives opt for the term Hispanics. Also has been mentioned that Hispanic is commonly used in the eastern portion of the United States, while Latino is more used in the western portion. Latinos, Hispanic in Texas, New Mexico, and California overwhelmingly prefer the term Hispanic, while those in New York opted to identify as Latino. I would say that here where I am in the border, people prefer to be called Mexican American. They are 95% of the total population. Next. Also, the first and second generation of immigrants have 2 times the odds of choosing Latino over Hispanic compared with third generation plus respondents. Non-white have higher relative odds of choosing Latino over Hispanic compared with those who identify themselves as white. And in terms of education, the relative odds of choosing Latino over Hispanic are 53% higher for respondents with at least a college degree when compared with those who have not completed college degree. Next. So which one to use? This is, there is no definition. There is no way to tell who is Latino. There's no skin color. The origin of the generations is quite diverse. So somebody is Latino or Hispanic or Latinx just because they say so. That's how it goes. So when we are writing, just use any of the terms, be consistent throughout the writing, provide a definition in a footnote for the readers who might not be familiar with the terminology used. Next, and here are some references of the information I have provided. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maestra. I now want to introduce Deidre Buchwald and Cole Alec. So Deidre is a professor of medicine in the Ellison S. Floyd College of Medicine at Washington State University and the director of the Institute for Research and Education to Advance Community Health, an institutionally supported unit that works with underserved health disparity populations. And Dr. Buchwald is also the founding director of Partnerships for Native Health, a group that conducts research, education, and training efforts with American Indians and Alaska Natives. And Cole is also affiliated and works with the Institute for Research to Educate and Advance Community Health with the Methods and Outreach Cores. And concurrently, he is working to finish his PhD in Indigenous Health at the University of North Dakota. They'll be talking to you about publications on American Indian and Alaska Native peoples.
Great, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And Cole and I want to extend our heartfelt thanks for the invitation to the two of us to provide some insights into the complex issue of American Indian Alaska Native identity, and also to elucidate the important role of tribal sovereignty in science and in the world of publication. So both of us are calling in from the Duwamish territory in Seattle, and we acknowledge the Duwamish people for their hospitality and their stewardship of the lands on which Seattle and iReach are located. So a word about myself. I'm an internist and an epidemiologist, and I trained decades ago in the days when, as in my medical school, only 10% of the students were women. And subsequently, as a member of a division at the University of Washington that had 120 faculty, I was the only female professor. Next, this slide, thank you. The last census revealed that by self-report, about 2% of the US population is American Indian and Alaska Native. It is important to note that many Native people have heritage in more than one tribal nation. In fact, it is possible to be half or 3/4 or even technically 100% Native, but not meet the enrollment requirements for any single tribal nation. So who you are is a very complex question in working not only with Indigenous people in general, but with American Indian and Alaska Native populations in particular. In particular, because tribes, as we call them, are considered domestic sovereign nations by the US government, issues of data sovereignty and tribal approvals for publications come into play, as Cole will be discussing in a little bit. Demands for data ownership and publication approvals are increasingly being exercised not only by tribal nations, but also a variety of other Indian organizations, both urban and rural. So let's start with a few definitions. Tribal nations. Tribal entities, which are variously called tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, or in Alaska, Alaska Native villages that have a formal nation-to-nation relationship with the US government are considered tribal nations. American Indian and Alaska Native people are persons that belong to indigenous tribes of the continental United States, American Indians, and the indigenous tribes and villages of Alaska. In Alaska, there's only one tribe per se. The remainder of the 262 tribal entities are villages. A Native American encompasses all indigenous people of the United States and its trust territories. So for example, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, the Chamorros of Guam, and American Samoans. Indian country is a common expression that refers to all tribal nations across the United States. Next slide. This slide shows graphically a tribal nation that exists within a nation. So tribal sovereignty refers to the right of American Indian and Alaska Natives to govern themselves. The US Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as distinct governments, and they have, with very few exceptions, identical powers as the federal and state governments in which they're located to regulate their internal affairs. So you can see here some of the areas, the domains in which tribal nations govern: culture, people, their land, and then overall governance, which includes healthcare systems. It includes the right to govern research and approve research and publications. And it also allows each tribe to create and determine its own requirements for tribal enrollment. Next. I'm going to turn it over to Cole now.
Thank you, Dr. Buchwald. So good morning, bonjour, everybody. I just wanted to kind of introduce myself quick before I dive into a few points, a little bit deeper than what Deidre kind of set up. But I am a enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain tribe of Chippewa Indians in North Dakota, where my family still lives. And so for the next few slides that I'm going to talk about, I'm bringing my own lived experience, as well as exercising some of the professional skills I've gained, not only working at iReach, but getting my PhD in Indigenous health. And so as a member, I think it's important to talk about, where I as a citizen fit in. And then it's a good call out, and it's especially important for research because a lot of our studies involve recruitment, especially when we're working with tribal peoples. And so it's important, especially when we're publishing, to talk about that recruitment and, the composition of that population. But tribal sovereignty or tribal membership, including enrollment, can kind of be a contentious topic. It's definitely complex. And as Deidre mentioned, it is up to each tribe specifically to determine what that enrollment criteria looks like. It wasn't necessarily a scientific process by those who recorded that first census. But for example, my tribe, our minimum blood quantum is a quarter. So you have to demonstrate that you are a quarter Turtle Mountain to be enrolled. So I'm exactly 3/8. And when I do this conversation with folks in public, I like to just pull out my enrollment card and show people, and then ask a rhetorical question that I don't want folks to answer. But because I'm 3/8, if I was to have children with someone who wasn't from my tribe, they would be 3/16, which for my math people in the room is less than a quarter. So they wouldn't be enrolled. But does that make my kids not Native? And so when it comes to things like, surveys and recruiting for participants, that's why we rely really heavily on self-reported, because it's not appropriate. And I wouldn't feel comfortable if someone asked me for my enrollment card or criteria. But I think the takeaway here, and on each slide we have a takeaway. So, because I know a lot of these topics can go, we need more time to talk about them. 5-10 minutes isn't much, but neither is an hour when we're talking about lived experience. But just recognizing that each tribe has a different view of its membership requirements, and that just to take that into consideration. Next slide, please. So contrary to mainstream views of tribal people, which often think of us as rural and reservation based, the vast majority of tribal peoples are living in large urban areas. As of the 2020 census, that percentage might actually be closer to 80% of tribal people living in urban areas. So that just kind of tells us that even today, there's still a large movement into urban areas, which is resulting in a very diverse intertribal urban population, myself included, right? My tribe and my people are all in North Dakota, and here I am in Seattle. Because this is such an unknown, overlooked segment of our population, it's really important for publications to include American Indian Alaska Natives and where they're coming from. Are you working with an urban community? Are you working with a specific tribe? As an Indigenous scholar myself, when I look through different publications and I see that Native people are in the study, my first thing is to go to the methods section and figure out, did they work with a tribe? Where did they get these participants from? How did they recruit them? How did they ask them about their identity? Just because it tells me and lets me know kind of what segment of the country I'm looking at, and just make sure that that's something that you include in your publication. Next slide, please. So Deidre kind of set the stage for tribal sovereignty in general, but the way it's being exerted currently is in this way of creating Indigenous methodologies. So for generations, Indigenous peoples have always been researchers and scientists. Pre-colonization, we cared for lands and peoples, but much of the research that's been conducted has been on our communities and not with us. And so because of this, there is a growing body of work of Indigenous methodologies, which include traditional knowledge, which is that historical knowledge that our people have carried generation to generation. And my PhD program is actually a really great example of building that workforce and specifically including Indigenous teachers in our curriculum and stuff. And so that's something that I've really enjoyed in my academic setting, is being taught by Indigenous people and for that specific purpose. Because it really gets at the question is like, who gets to decide what evidence is, right? So we always hear about evidence-based practices, but so few of those evidence-based practices have included not only traditional knowledge, but just Native people in their design. And so we're, essentially kind of challenging what that definition is, but specific to the context of our topic today, it's really important to recognize the importance and cultural value of Native elders and how they play important roles as kind of the holders of our knowledge and our practices and our customs. And our Indigenous, Native elder population is rapidly growing. In fact, it may grow up by 7 times by 2050. And so we have a kind of ballooning population of elders that we need to care for. And so just really centering them in the work that we do is extremely important. Next slide. And then specific to how tribal sovereignty is being exerted, especially in the realm of research, there's a movement from that data dependency to data sovereignty via the control and use of data. And so the key element here is that, this governance piece talks about how tribes are driving the research topics and deciding who they get to work with, whether it be internal or external partners or Indigenous versus non-Indigenous peoples. And to do this work, there's really important elements of decolonization that need to happen, not only in the data, but just, even in the process. So it's really important to talk about Indigenous ways of knowing and being, to create some of these new methods in order to conduct Indigenous-led and Indigenous-specific research. And most importantly, that includes including our elders and traditional knowledge. So any work that's done must take into consideration this movement, from data dependency to data sovereignty, and kind of respect where communities fall on that spectrum. So respecting and honoring the sovereignty of the nation is important, its community, and its research mechanisms, which may include things like approval of publications and partnerships. So that was a very quick dive into some of these topics, but I'm going to have Deidre kind of take us home.
Great, thank you, Cole, for that intriguing and stimulating dip into some of the really important issues that we examine, ascertain, think about, pontificate about every single day in our work. So one of the things I want to emphasize, being a non-native scholar and having worked with Native peoples for about 30 years, is if you aren't sure, ask. It is such an important concept to ask when you're ignorant, when you don't know. And I have never had a single episode where I've gone wrong by asking. Native Journalists Association recommends using specific tribal affiliations when appropriate and approved. And I'll just explicate a little bit here. In some instances, tribal nations or urban Indian health organizations, for example, will not want their entity specifically named, and in others they will. So one has to ask whether it's appropriate to cite a particular organization or tribal nation. Another important point is to use nation instead of tribe, if possible. And again, the specific tribe is preferable, and or specify if it's an urban Indian population and from what catchment area that population comes from. Avoid possessive language like using New York's tribes, which is very generic. It doesn't name the tribes, it doesn't acknowledge the tribes, which in turn acknowledges their cultural, geographic, and historical differences. Expand definitions of evidence to include and honor indigenous methodologies and traditional knowledge. That means moving away from evidence-based practices to practice-based evidence, and include Native people to ensure accurate data collection, representation, and interpretation. At each point, it is important to include the Native perspective to make sure that the data actually capture the constructs that we're trying to examine. Next slide. Thank you very much on behalf of myself and Cole, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right. We're going to open it up now to discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and ask all our presenters to come back if you could put your video on. Okay. Well, thanks all. I know we're a little tight on time and we have about 10 minutes for questions. I wanted to bring to the group one of the first questions that was asked and get some suggestions. And so one of the big pieces we've been talking about, right, the review of publications for the journal. And so someone asked about this double-blinded review as an option to reduce bias based on the author's sex or race and ethnicity. And they said that oftentimes it's possible to guess who the authors might be based on some citations or the study names or even the location of the study sites. So they were saying that, you know, sex and race ethnicity often, you know, do not remain blinded. So wanted to get your thoughts from our panel on the issue around the blinding of reviews. So maybe I know like Kathy, Lou, if you might have some responses as well as any others.
I might say many journals are doing this now. And in some sense, I think it's a good idea. But on the other hand, it does not address some of the very important points that Kathy mentioned about acknowledging who the authors are and the reviewers, and making sure that citations are appropriately referencing people from different backgrounds. So as most of these issues are, it's a double-edged sword, and it's hard to know what is appropriate. It certainly can, I think, relieve some of the biases, but as Dr. Kim, who asked this question, mentions, reviewers often intuit who is actually writing this from the citations that they choose. I don't know if Kathy, you have additional thoughts about whether that would be a good approach or not.
Up, you're on mute.
You're muted, Kathy. We don't hear you.
That's the problem. I think it's a mixed bag because of my 4 sections, one of them does double blind. And I think reviewers are able to identify who the authors are because we get frequent emails saying, I can't review this, I have a conflict. I know I can tell who wrote it. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, that is a problem too, because you can't determine who has a conflict if in fact you're blinded.
So, you know, in really thinking about it, if we think about our spaces as scientists, you know, as we dive in more granularly, there's only going to be a certain number of experts in each of our spaces, right? So 9 times out of 10, just based on what we're asked to review, we're going to know the authors anyway, not just based on their race, but just based on the science that's being submitted to our professional journals. So a double blind review may not even address any of those concerns as well. So it ends up being like Lou stated, a double-edged sword. I wish more journals would ask for reviewers to self-report those of us that are willing our race, our ethnicity, our gender identity, our biological sex, and, you know, and things like that, so that the journals can have more of an insight on those of us who are willing to review as well. And I know that that takes time to change.
Any other? All right, let's move to, yeah.
Oh, quickly, I was going to say, as a clinical psychologist, I had a lot of training that was focused on how to manage biases, right? And one of those rules was not really to ignore or try to get around that something was there, but to actually sit with it and figure out how to respond appropriately. And it seems like something that would carry over into this space as well, for some of the reasons that maybe Joy was listing there. But better to actually look at the biases, have conversations, and figure out how to manage them, because I think there's always going to be a tell, and it's a very small world.
That's a good point.
There were some other comments in the chat about sort of the language that's used around, so Latin with an asterisk symbol, as well as Hispanic, as well as some of the race ethnicity categories that are currently used in the US. And Dr. Ballsbury had mentioned, you know, many of these lack sort of the definition to honor people's heritages. So I wanted to get some feedback from the committee around the use of, a lot of what we've talked about is around the use of language, right? And what are maybe one of a recommendation you have to someone that wants to submit to a journal? What are some things they should be thinking about around the use of race, ethnicity language in their publications?
I think the first, go ahead, Dr. Thorpe.
No, please, ladies first.
Okay. So one of the first things is, I think that we need to acknowledge how the data is collected. Is it self-report, or is it from a medical record? Like, how did the demographic, not only race and ethnicity, but how were the demographics collected for the study participants? And how were those demographics defined? So, you know, and it's the same for gender identity and gender expression as well. So I think that that's the starting place. And if we don't acknowledge, you know, how those variables are defined, then we don't really know what the inferences are going to be. Dr. Thorpe?
Yeah, so thank you. So my take on it is that first of all, we need to understand for why and understand what the definitions were the intended purpose of the definitions, right? So the intended purpose of the definition for race and ethnicity is not to be able to share someone's heritage or their cultural values. It was merely to be able to design to identify people and put them in different classifications. If you go back to the OMB Directive 15 from 1977, then go to 1997 to understand why they made changes. But these never were designed. They never were really designed and they still today don't capture any of these the nuanced things that we really want them to capture. But my advice would really be is that what I do in my writing is if I'm using a data set, I go see to the code book, figure out what they use, what terminology they use, and I'd be consistent throughout the terminology there. Whether I agree with it or not, that's a whole nother issue, but at least I'm being consistent for which the people who collected that data and how and they intended it. And then that's a decision if I want to use that data or not use that data. But when I do that, I'm using secondary data analysis. That's one thing that I do. And then I make comment in the discussion section about the use of it or how it made the differences may be, or how the findings may be different if I would have interpreted them a different way based on other things. But that's what I typically do. And I try to be consistent and honor the categories that those people who collected the data.
Dr. Flatt, if you allow me, I want to say that in relationship to the Hispanic Latino population, I think it is important to report the origins. For example, not all the Hispanics in Florida are from Cuba. And they're coming from very different origins. And not everybody in California is Mexican or Mexican American. So I think that it is the optimal situation will be to collect the origin of and report not only Hispanic or Latino as a big bag, but at least generate 80% or 70% of so are Mexican American or of Mexican origin. Something that really will allow to see the differences within the different groups, because that's the big problem when we are studying this population is that we put everybody in the same bag, and the risk factors for diseases and the social determinants might be very different from somebody coming from Argentina than somebody coming from Honduras, for example.
And I'll just add one thing on behalf of American Indian Alaska Natives. Roland, I agree. How the question is asked in a data set is absolutely critical to interpreting what the data tell us. And in the United States, probably less than 20% of American Indians are what we might call full blood. That is 100% of their tribal background comes from one tribe, probably far less, but that's at least one estimate. What that means is that most people are mixed race, whether they're mixed with another tribe or whether they're mixed with whites, it's all across the board. And we've made the mistake of asking people, are you American Indian, Alaska Native, and then having mixed race as an option. But then we've come to find out over the years that we have to ask what their primary affiliation is. It might be a tribe that's a minority background because they grew up on that reservation. It might be that they're white. Many urban Indians particularly are really well integrated and acculturated. So this is sort of a multi-step identification process that is really complicated, and it depends so much on how the questions are asked. And as Joyce said, how far do you want to dig? How deep do you want to dig to get the exact way that people affiliate?
And I hear from many of your talks, the big focus is to ask. right? Just ask if
Ask.
you don't know, right? Hear from the community. Joy had talked about, right? Sharing, perhaps if you're working with a group, get some of their feedback on how you're going to be disseminating this data around the language, around even how you're interpreting the results, right? So that it comes from the community and really represents their views, and they're able to acknowledge or give you advice on ways to make it more customized. We've run out of time, so I want to just pass back the mic to Lou to do a closing for us, and want to express my appreciation to all of you and our attendees for being here today.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you to all of our panelists who really had terrific presentations. I learned so much and so many insights, and this is just the beginning of our awareness and our understanding. Thanks to you, those of you who have participated. For you and for those who haven't participated, the proceedings of today's webinar will be made available on the GSA website and on GSA's YouTube channel. You can search it through YouTube, and it will be free for a period of time until it becomes incorporated into the GSA archives. So please look that up, tell your colleagues, and please submit your papers to JGMS, and keep in mind some of the guidelines that we have presented to you today. Thank you all. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.